honor and a privilege to introduce your teacher in life. So I get to introduce my teacher, Dr. Lant Pritchett. So I think he doesn't need much of an introduction, but to actually get the thing started, I think for those of you who don't know Lant's background, I'll say a few words, but we're really excited to have him here this morning, and everybody's looking forward to listening to Lant. Lant is a development economist from Idaho. He graduated from BYU in 1983, and he completed his PhD from MIT in 1988. From almost 20 years at the World Bank, spent time in India and Indonesia. He spent almost 20 odd years teaching at the Kennedy School, and intermittently being the faculty chair of the MPAID program at Harvard. Since then, I think the joke is that he has tried to retire 3 times in his life unsuccessfully. So I think from 2018 to 2023, he was at, he was the research director of the RISE program at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. And now he is currently the visiting professor at London School of Economics. Also co-founded and research director of Labor Mobility Partnerships. He's published over 100 works with about 50 co-authors, and incredibly 50,000 citations. So Lant is an institution in himself, and it's really an honor and privilege to not only welcome my teacher, but a leading development economist. Lant, welcome.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm usually skeptical of the institution's literature, but I suppose if I'm an institution, I must have to change my mind about that. I'm sorry I'm coming to you in black and white. I don't know why, but my USB camera decided that I was an ancient figure and needed to be portrayed in my true age. So I'm coming to you in the way I watched television as a child. So I'm going to talk about governance and inclusion, which is the theme of the conference. And I'm going to start with a sort of narrative of end of history versus hell in a handbasket. In 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sense that the contestation over the ways in which systems would work was over, and we would move immediately towards kind of a convergence in bureaucracy, convergence in politics, convergence in economics, and that's kind of not the way it's turned out. So the 4 elements of the presentation. First, I want to talk about the kind of fact that the 4 elements, the various dimensions of national development, are not moving together in the way that the end of history kind of view hoped, and that in many cases economic growth has been very rapid, but that has been accompanied by stagnating or even deteriorating state capability and stagnating or deteriorating state legitimacy, kind of a rubric for the quality of the polity. And often this tension between rapid economic growth but deteriorating capability in politics ends in what is perhaps exaggerated, but can be called hell in a handbasket. It often ends up in kind of regime changes and uncertainty. So I want to lay out kind of that narrative. Then I want to talk more specifically about governance and inclusion. So I want to move a bit beyond constructive ambiguity and discuss different concepts of inclusion, and then also be clear about the constructive ambiguity behind governance, and then lead to kind of a novel, I think, to me, argument about the pathways to this conflict between economic growth being very successful, but state capability being and legitimacy being eroded, which is a tension between the beautiful laws that are in place and the actual way in which business is done. So next slide. So the vision of development that I've always taken is a 4-fold highway to human well-being. So next slide. National development was ways in which people in countries would cooperate to effectively accomplish purposes. So you would cooperate economically, politically, bureaucracies. So there are four transitions involved in a successful national development experience. One, the country transits from low productivity to high productivity as people get more sophisticated and more advanced in creating high value. There's a transition of the polity from subject to citizen. Once the colonial taskmasters are overthrown and gotten rid of, then the hope was that you would develop a polity that would be those that exercise the power would be responsive and accountable to citizen needs and wishes and wants. There would be a transition to equal treatment of fellow citizens, a sense of national identity that lead to at least a modest amount of social cohesion, and you would lead to capable organizations of administration. So when the government decided as government to set out about to do something, they would have capable organizations that could effectively carry that out. So they could enforce the law, they could regulate industry, they could regulate the environment, they could collect taxes, the various functions that a state needs to carry out, both to rule and to serve. So this is the fourfold transformation. Next slide. Next slide. Have I lost you?
Sir, I'm here. I'm just moving the slide. Stuck here. Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, and let's skip that slide because that's kind of just a text repeat. And it turns out that this fourfold transformation of national development really does pay off in high human well-being. This national development experience was instrumental to achieving the things that people want. And so this is from a recent paper of mine where I just compare kind of an aggregate index of all the good things that you might want, measured without economics, without GDP, without poverty, without any money metric, but just direct measures of health, water and sanitation, malnutrition, kind of everything you can imagine. And what it shows is that, and then I regress that. I ask how much of the variation across countries in social progress is just associated with variation in just three factors: GDP per capita, a measure of state capability, which is a measure of, from the world governance indicators, of rule of law, control of corruption, government effectiveness, and regulatory quality, and a measure of democracy. It turns out that national development really does deliver, and basically only national development delivers. So national development is both an empirically necessary condition. There is no country. This envelopment curve isn't standard errors. It's literally all of the experiences of the countries in the world are within that bound. So no country gets to high levels of human well-being without national development, and no country that gets to national development doesn't also get to high levels of human well-being. And up in the corner there is the literal Denmark. All of the advanced countries are kind of up in this cluster of countries that have very high national development and very high levels of well-being. Next slide. So the end of history, and this is capital E, capital H, end in the sense of a goal, and H in the sense that history has a teleological Weltgeist in the Hegelian sense, moving towards that goal. Next slide. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist, wrote a famous paper arguing that the kind of ideological debates of the 20th century were over, that the combination of electoral democracy, civil service bureaucracies, and managed capitalism was the only idea left as to how to successfully manage systems, and that the other alternatives of Bolshevism and absolute rule of kings and fascism had basically discredited themselves and been on the junkyard of history, and that the only path forward was that there would be some happy convergence in which countries would now tread along the path towards these three goals of basically well-functioning political systems, well-functioning bureaucracies, and highly productive or increasing economic growth. So that was kind of a not crazy view at the time. Next slide. And there are some countries that have been there and some countries that are getting there. So I'm just going to show you graphs. Next slide. These graphs have three political sort of indicators and one indicator of GDP per capita in PPP. So the pink line is GDP per capita, and then there's an indicator of state capability, which is the orange line, an indicator of state legitimacy, which is the dotted blue line, and an indicator of quality of public services. And this is what Denmark looks like. This is the corners up in that northeast segment of high national development. These are what the indicators look like for them. They have in this graph, GDP is scaled so that slopes represent growth rates accurately across countries, but the levels adjusted. So Denmark has a very high level of GDP, growing along steadily if slowly, and it has consistently high levels of state legitimacy, state capability, and public services. Next slide. This describes the state legitimacy and public services indicators. That's for looking at the slides later. And this is the same graph with, again, the data for the complete periods for which these various indicators are available shown. This is Estonia. And Estonia is the Fukuyama vision, essentially. It has GDP per capita has more than doubled since 1990. And in addition, state capability has gone from already quite high levels to higher levels, and state legitimacy has gone from low levels in 2006 to near Denmark levels by 2023. And so this is kind of the vision that these various aspects of national development would go together. There would be common movement towards these things. However, this is Estonia is a relatively rare case, it turns out. And hell in a handbasket is perhaps overly strong characterization that in many regions of the world, we've seen either continued stagnation on all fronts. That is, some places in Africa have remained failed states. They haven't had economic growth. They haven't had state legitimacy. But we've also seen lots of regions that have had rapid or rapid-ish, at least, growth, but actual reversals in state capability and state legitimacy. So rather than these three phenomena going together, this is the graph for Belarusia, about which I know nothing other than the data I'm showing you. But it just illustrates that, Belarus, since the transition, obviously had the fall post-transition, but has since recovered to where GDP is more than twice as high as it was in 1990. So the cumulative growth rate over this whole period is 4%, which is a very respectable economic performance. But state capability has sort of deteriorated, got a little better, and then has collapsed again to where state capability is lower now in 2020 and 2022 is the most recent data than it was in 1990. And more importantly, state legitimacy, which was never very high, has actually collapsed to very low levels. All of these indicators are on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is essentially the lowest any country has ever been on this indicator. So a place that has descended into complete civil war or chaos like Syria or Somalia is a 0. So the fact that Belarus's state legitimacy as 1 has meant they've managed to create reasonable levels of upper middle income levels of economic performance, but with deteriorating state legitimacy and with stagnating and kind of fluctuating state capability. So they are not moving in this common direction where all the elements of national development are going together. The next slide. And this Belarus experience is not unique. This is seven kind of former Soviet Union countries. And in this graph, I show the change over the entire period for which we have the data of each of these three indicators of growth, state capability, and state legitimacy. And what you see is many countries where the green bar, which is economic growth, has actually performed quite well. And somewhat confusingly, but I think to our advantage, the number displayed by the bar is not the change, is not the number of the bar, but it's the level at the end of the period. So again, as we saw, Belarus has $27,000 per capita GDP, but has had deteriorating state capability and deteriorating state legitimacy. And kind of across the board in these former Soviet Union countries, state legitimacy has deteriorated almost uniformly and to very, very low levels. As you see, Turkmenistan is at 0.2, where Somalia is a 0, and Denmark is a 10. So we're not seeing in that region anything like this adoption of a kind of the ideological triumph that they're moving towards high capability rule of law, state legitimacy. But many of them have had a pretty impressive economic recovery and growth. Next slide. This is a same sort of slide showing the changes over time in various countries. And this is, I'm showing the countries, kind of the frontline countries of the Arab Spring. Again, Arab Spring was seen as a positive shock. These countries were going to move away from their autocratic past. But instead, we got, in some ways, it was a shock, but not a very positive one for many countries, with Yemen, Syria, and Libya basically falling into complete chaos, civil war, and I mean, Syria, as you see, hits exact 0 on a state legitimacy, which this was before the recent collapse even. And other countries kind of muddling along. The best kind of performance you see is Tunisia, with some recovery of state legitimacy, but deteriorating state capability from this overall thing. So again, just I'm trying to illustrate that we don't. Next slide. Anyway, well, I'll get back to this. That we don't really see that there's any tendency for these three dimensions of national development to be moving in common ways. And so while the institutionalists might say you need high quality institutions in order to achieve high levels of GDP per capita and high levels of prosperity and high levels of human well-being, and that's true, that's not a picture of the dynamics. That's not what's happening in the short run. That's not what's happening in the long run. There doesn't seem to be any close association between progress on these various indicators in the short run. So let me move just to governance and inclusion, and then I'll come back to this question of national development, and I will get somewhat to Pakistan. So first I want to say, inclusion is, I had a friend recently say that one of the big advantages of economists is they're socially awkward, and hence they lack social desirability bias, and hence they say things that are true but nobody wants to hear. A large degree of the discourse in the world is people trying to sound like they agree and having constructive ambiguity that creates terms where everybody could agree this is a good thing without agreeing on what it really is. So I think inclusion is one of those things. Who could be against inclusion? But one reason it's hard to be against inclusion is it could mean so many different things. One thing inclusion could mean is you focus on post-tax and transfer incomes or consumption. So in one sense, you let the market operate, and that generates a series of outcomes across households and individuals. And then the government, through tax and transfer schemes, reestablishes a more acceptable distribution of consumption through redistributive programs and taxes and transfers. And so this is a vision of inclusion as redistribution. Um, uh, and the main instruments are, specific programmatic interventions of the government. The second notion of inclusion is that you arrange the working of the economic system so as to maximally include the broadest possible swath of the population into opportunities for high productivity. So you think of, are people able to include them into highly productive, high value added production processes such that their existing assets of labor, land are highly rewarded? And so this is really a more focus on the pre-tax transfer distribution of incomes, and more focus on inclusion into that would mean a focus on rising with economic growth, with broad-based economic growth, distribution of incomes, and that the pre-tax transfer inequality is lower as people are able to have more equality of opportunity in inclusion, through inclusion. Next slide. There are two other common meanings of inclusion, which they just are less economic, and I'm not really going to talk about them, but I just want to be clear that I'm not talking about those. Back. Could we go back? One is just equal treatment under the law. So individuals are not actively excluded from opportunity due to their characteristics of race, ethnicity, sex, etc., and hence marginalization via either socially enforced or legally enforced norms and prejudices is active exclusion. So this would be inclusion as lack of discrimination. And the other is inclusion implying there's a set of positive rights or entitlements to certain merit goods or opportunities. So if a child isn't going to school, one could say they were excluded from school, whatever the causal mechanism that generated that, because we feel that inclusion as a citizen is an entitlement to participation in certain activities, whether or not they're economic or not. So next slide. Now, my controversial claim is that development economics, or originating in the North or West, or perhaps particularly in the Northeast of the United States, has been putting radically too much attention to inclusion as redistribution, and conversely, too little attention to inclusion into productivity through broad-based growth. And I think this is just wrong. Next slide. I think it's wrong in and this led to kind of a fundamental confusion between kind of a poverty agenda where poverty was measured at very low bar of poverty lines, or an inequality in consumption agenda that was programmatic focused versus a broad-based growth agenda. And I think this focus was wrong in every way it could possibly be wrong. So next slide. The most important of which is if you take the distribution of poverty at basically any poverty line, and you ask what is associated with a country's poverty rate, it turns out a country's poverty rate at a given time and place is just completely determined by the median of consumption of households in that country and time. There's just nothing left over. So the R squared of the R squared of regressing poverty rates on median consumption is 0.988, which is just not an association that's typically found in the wild. It means essentially there's almost no difference among countries with equivalent median consumption in their poverty rates, and that's even more true at low levels of median consumption than at high levels. And so basically poverty is a phenomena of broad-based growth. There's nothing left over to explain once you've accounted for broad-based growth. And I'm not going to stop and argue this, but maybe we can pick it up in the Q&A. Everything else about this is wrong. It's wrong as economics. It's wrong as politics. It's wrong morally. It's just wrong in every way it can be wrong. So I think if we want to talk inclusion, we want to talk inclusion into the national development process. Next slide. And now I want to return to this graph that I showed between social progress generally and national development generally, because I want to emphasize two kind of important empirical features of this association. The social progress index comes in an overall index, but it comes in these three kind of increasingly, call them sophisticated or advanced measures. So you start with basic human needs like malnutrition, access to water, access to electricity. You move to foundations of well-being, which is, more sophisticated health conditions, environmental quality, access to education, and finally opportunity starts to get to higher order needs like freedom and personal rights and access to advanced education. Next slide. Now, when I did the empirical association between how much does a movement in GDP per capita matter for including this indicator of well-being versus, say, an improvement in state capability versus, say, an equivalent improvement in democracy, I find two. And by the way, the relationship with GDP per capita is allowed to be nonlinear because we, as economists, expect it to be nonlinear because we understand that the angle curve, we understand that people have a higher marginal propensity to spend on basics at low income than high income. So we have to expect a nonlinear relationship between overall levels of spending and various components of an index of well-being. And that's what we find. We find that two things. One, if we ask how important is growth, and let me just explain this figure, for each of those four indicators, the overall index, basic human needs, foundations, and opportunity, I'm asking, I've broken up how much movement matters across three levels. So the leftmost set of bars is moving from the minimum it could possibly be to the middle of the first country tercile. The next is from the middle of the first country tercile to the middle of the second tercile. So roughly the development process from being poor but stable to being middle income. And the last set of bars are how much it matters to go from the middle of the second tercile to the middle of the third tercile, so becoming essentially a developed country. And two important things. One, for basic human needs, economic growth is super important and state capability is important. And it's much more important at lower and middle levels of income than it is at higher levels of income, and much more important for basics than the higher order things. And second, state capability is very important for achieving high levels of well-being in nearly all of the indicators at nearly all of the levels. And state capability becomes relatively more important compared to GDP as development progresses. So when I say national development, I'm a big fan of economic growth. I have written papers saying that we've underestimated the importance of economic growth in economics in favor of programmatic interventions, but I'm not saying it's everything. State capability matters. The ability of the state to effectively create rule of law, to prevent crime, to assure human rights is super important. And so that said, democracy doesn't really turn out to be empirically strongly associated until you get to the very highest order elements of well-being. Next slide. And this is just saying, so the reason I'm stressing this is because that does mean that we're concerned about economic growth and state capability jointly, because if you get both of them, you get the addition of those two bars. If you only get one, you just get the bar. But if you get economic growth at the expense of deteriorating state capability, that's going to lead you to have less expectation of improvement than if your growth strategy is consistent with expanding state capability. Next slide. Let's skip this slide. It's great, but we're skipping it for now. Skipping this one too. It's great, but I'm skipping it for now. So let's come back then to what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is that we kind of have this weird situation in development economics where we have a bunch of people looking at programmatic interventions and their cost effectiveness and their effectiveness, but which we know these programmatic interventions aren't really the important exogenous determinants of well-being. We know that national development is the causal driver of improvements of national well-being. On the other side, we have kind of the institutionalists. We have two pairs of trios that have won Nobel Prizes in development economics recently. And the institutionalists are telling us, if you get to have really high quality and inclusive institutions, that is associated with achieving high levels of human well-being in the long run, but they don't have a coherent theory of the dynamics. They don't have any theory of what is the pathway. And this conference is called Pathways to Development. They don't have any theory of sequencing. Is it important that economic growth come first and then state capability and then democracy? Is it important that democracy come first in order to generate state capability and then growth? They don't have any sense of prioritization. What's going to be if you were an activist attempting to improve your country, what should you focus on? What's your priority? Is your priority establishing rule of law? Is your priority establishing democracy? Is your priority establishing economic growth? And they don't have any real theory of the feedback loops. That is, are there strategies for doing one of these that's inimical to achieving the others? So I think what I'm trying to get to is we actually need to put more attention, because what we have had over the recent decades is a huge variety in observed pathways in which countries have had various degrees of success, both across these indicators. So next slide. So I'm just going to show Indonesia, for instance, is a country like Estonia, but at a much lower level, but in which rapid economic growth, increasing state capability, and increasing state legitimacy, especially since 2015, have gone together. So Indonesia has, again, a kind of end of history model in which somehow the economic growth has been consistent with higher capability, higher legitimacy, and vice versa. Next slide. We've had other countries like Vietnam that has been even more successful than Indonesia in economic growth since 1990. Growing from 2,400 in 1990 when Vietnam was a desperately poor country to over 13,000 today. But at the same time, let's go. Don't ruin the surprise here. At the same time, they've done so with deteriorating state legitimacy and without really strongly improving state capability. And so public services, the green line, has gone up, but it's gone up mainly as a consequence of the economic growth rather than there being any demonstrated improvement in state capability. So that's a very different pattern than Indonesia. And this is what the data say about Pakistan. I am not presenting myself as an expert on Pakistan, either recent or current events or anything. I'm comparing it on the data, what the data says. And Pakistan has been a country that has combined average growth. It really is literally almost the average growth rate in the world of about 2% per capita, 2% per annum per capita since 1990. So it has seen its GDP grow, but as opposed to Vietnam going from 2.4 to over 13, Pakistan's gone from 3.2 to 5.6 thousand or 5,600. And at the same time, state capability has been a moderate level and stagnating. So it's not a super low capability state by this measure. And state legitimacy has improved since 2015, but still is at a quite low level. So it's a different pattern. It hasn't had a rapid economic growth, but it hasn't had a sharp deterioration in the data in state legitimacy, nor a sharp deterioration in the data in state capability. So next slide. And this just illustrates the recent outcomes on the three elements of the pathway to development. So if we think of the pathway to development as being, these joint dynamics that would improve the various dimensions that we know are ultimately going to deliver on high human well-being, we basically just see everything that can happen has happened. So, on the left of the figure is Pakistan, which has had improving state legitimacy, but only to a level of 2.7, which is still in a range where, regime shifts happen because of lack of legitimacy, and its state capability has stagnated at a level that's about the 40th percentile of the world at about 3.6. Vietnam, of course, was a completely different experience, improved state capability, but deteriorating legitimacy with very rapid growth. Indonesia has improved capability to quite high levels. 5.2 is about the world mean of state capability, and improvement to relatively high levels of state legitimacy, accompanied with economic growth. We have also seen Cambodia, KHM, is Cambodia, which has had the same growth rate as Indonesia. And the green bars are actually the total gain, whereas the number shows you the percent per annum. So these have roughly almost identical percent per annum growth, but it's a smaller absolute number in Cambodia. But with low and stagnant state capability at about the same level as Pakistan, but rapidly deteriorating to a very, very low level of state legitimacy. And then kind of everything in between. I show Bangladesh. The Philippines has been a moderate growth country with higher legitimacy, lower capability. And China, you have to show China. China has had spectacularly rapid economic growth, as we all know. But the measured final, 2023 level of state legitimacy in India, even though it's improved some modestly, is still only 1.9, which means by these rankings of the state legitimacy metric that was described above, it still has very low state legitimacy, but again, very strong capability of the state. So next slide. Now, I'm going to end with, and I'm trying to keep it to exactly 40 minutes of my presentation, leave time for questions. There's a kind of basic narrative that I think is worrisome, which is countries have been managed to create rapid economic growth in spite of low quality institutions, which is in some ways an optimistic thing, because it doesn't mean you need to get to good institutions to get to growth and then you'd be in a vicious cycle. But oftentimes, this is done by creating what I call a closed order deal environment. That is, countries, for a variety of reasons, including isomorphism, have adopted what I call beautiful laws. They're laws and formal procedures that provide labor protection and environmental regulation. And in many instances, these regulations that are on the books are just far beyond the actual capability of the organizations to enforce them in a neutral, universal way. And so this creates a chaotic environment in which private actors can't really predict what will happen to them because the inconsistency between law and enforcement. But next slide. But you can initiate an episode of rapid growth if you create a reasonably stable macroeconomic environment, get rid of wildly misaligned macroeconomic prices like exchange rates, and reasonable price stability. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be reasonable. And you move to an attractive environment for investment and innovation. But a way to create an attractive environment, rather than creating an attractive environment that affects everyone, often the shift to higher investor expectations is created not by better rules or by rule of law, but by closed order deals. And by order deals, I mean if you made a deal with Suharto in Indonesia prior to 1996, you knew that your deal was going to stay done. And the deals are closed in the sense that some actors in the economy are eligible for these deals and others just aren't. So sometimes it's only the large firms that get the good deals. Sometimes it's the politically connected firms that get good deals, as it was in Egypt or Tunisia. Sometimes it's favored national investors where, Chinese investors are favored and have preferential treatment. Other times it's by region, other times it's by sector. But basically, the economy creates not universally good rules or policies that foment economic growth, but create islands of that. And that is successful in creating growth. It just isn't the case that to create economic growth, one needs rule of law, and it's not the case one needs good policies. I mean, many of these high performing countries had overall just a really terrible environment for doing business, but investors had climate control. Investments were in air conditioned conditions, so they got differentially good treatment, and that was enough to create growth. Next slide, and I'm just almost done. The problem with this is that we have to worry about when you create economic growth with closed order deals, what are the feedback loops to state capability and what are the feedback loops to state legitimacy? So the problem is if you continue to have a formal set of rules that are not enforced or not uniformly enforced or not informed in a universal and transparent way, and then you create closed order deals for favored investors, it does several things. One, it undermines state capability as the regulatory institutions are necessarily committed to unequal treatment of actors. It creates a dual economy in which those inside the closed order deal economy are allowed to be productive and those outside are facing chaotic and perhaps predatory deals and are located in an informal economy in which it was very hard to create the long-term cooperation and commitments that it takes to reach high productivity. And all of this tends to undermine the legitimacy of the state. So even if you started with a kind of liberal democracy, attempting to sustain closed order deals often leads the democracy to get less and less liberal, tolerate less and less dissent, tolerate less and less openness, tolerate less and less true political competition because you need to maintain the rents that feed the economy. And if it's not democratic, you create an environment in which the closed order deal reinforces itself. Last slide. So what I want to say is good governance and inclusion are two sides of the same coin. That the goal of economic inclusion is that the rising opportunity for individuals to participate in highly productive value creation through good jobs in large productive firms or opportunities for real entrepreneurship. That is the creation of firms that can grow if successful. And that is the form of inclusion that is most critical, I think, to a positive feedback loop of national development. And that this requires of governments that there be rule of law, but you can only have rule of law if you have laws that can be the rules. And McCloskey has a wonderful phrase that the essence of the growth to prosperity was an environment that gave equal permission to give it a go. And this requires that laws be rules, and then it requires a feedback loop that leads to an ever expanding space of available good deals on the path to rules. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we'll take questions, maybe a set of 3 questions, Lant, and then you can respond to them.
Okay.
There's a mic going around in the room, so I see a question there.
There's going to be
another one here. They're in the middle.
I'm going to step out of the camera and get a pen so I can.
All right. You can go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I'm not an economist by discipline, I'm a poet actually. I wanted to ask, as you said, you're not an expert on Pakistan. Now, of course, Pakistan does not exist in a vacuum, and I was wondering if you can tell me which countries, in your opinion and in your research, have, over the past 40, 50 years, countries in the global south, like Pakistan, that were previously colonized, like Pakistan, that have achieved high degrees of economic growth and state legitimacy at an above average kind of rate. If you can go into patterns that you've observed across those countries, that'd be great. I realize that that's maybe asking too much. Even if you just can tell me which countries you've observed that in, I would be interested in looking them up and seeing what I can observe in common myself. Thank you so much.
There's one question on this side of the room, and then the third one is back there.
Hi, thank you for that very informative.
And you can introduce yourself and maybe an affiliation.
Yes. So, hi, Lant. I'm Ali Kasuria. I used to work out of the World Bank Institute and with the Open Government Partnership, and we've worked with the problem-driven iterative adaptation as an approach to build state capabilities and to improve service delivery. So I guess the question for you is, how do you see the landscape for support for providing these services to build state capabilities? Is there something other than the Harvard way or the McKinsey way? Is there some additional institutional support which can be more open source for countries like Pakistan or elsewhere? Thanks.
Go ahead.
Hello, Suleiman from PITE. Thank you for your lecture. There is a lot to disagree with you, but I would particularly like to know what are your moral arguments against inclusion as redistribution. I mean, for me, that is the primary function of the state to ensure economic well-being of the people through redistribution. So what are your moral arguments apart from other arguments? Not please give me arguments and not a sweeping statement like you did in the lecture. Thank you.
All right. Lant, you can respond to them in order or whichever way you feel.
Okay. I'll start with the last. So my argument isn't against redistribution generally. My argument is against low bar poverty lines. Taking a poverty indicator as your indicator and using that to target redistribution, I think is immoral because the basic golden rule is you do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself, and none of us live our lives by a poverty line. None of us think the poverty line is an important metric of our well-being. None of us believe that our increment to well-being as judged by the government should go to zero at exactly a poverty line. So I think it wasn't redistribution generally that I find immoral. It's the development tendency to have adopted and taken the view that development is primarily a feature of poverty reduction, with the definition of poverty being hinged on low bar poverty lines. So I was going very fast and not really making, I clearly wasn't clear enough about that. So it's not redistribution generally. The redistribution is the core function of the state is a little surreal, but okay, we won't. But it's not immoral. I think low bar poverty lines and taking development as being around that, I think is immoral because none of the people in the audience would say at a $2.16 per person per day, your needs were met and the government should stop being concerned about your level of prosperity. So I think that is just ridiculous. It's been ridiculous. I don't know how it's, well, I have conjectures on how it's persistent. So that's specifically what I was saying. Building state capability. So building state capability, our PDAA approach is open source. We don't charge any money for it. I resent being included in the, maybe I should unblur my background and you could see that I would resent being included in the same category as McKinsey. I have deliberately failed to monetize on ideas about how to build state capability, but I think PDAA is an organizational strategy. So if you think I am a person, I'm working with an organization, they have the following objectives. How would I build within a political regime and context the capability of my organization to build its capability to be successful at solving problems that are locally nominated? I think PDIA is a broad-based approach that works pretty well. But it is an organizational approach. It's much more likely to be broadly effective in a variety of contexts for service delivery than it is necessarily for regulation. So trying to take a PDIA approach to tax can be very hard because many people are untaxed precisely because they are embedded in a political deal that exempts them from essentially living the law that the taxation promulgates. So I think the PDIA is an open source and valuable way to think about building capability, but it's not a countrywide approach. And if you're trapped in this closed order deal dynamic, it's almost impossible to generate the political support to develop a more effective regulatory organization. So, your erstwhile fellow Pakistanis in Bangladesh have just reaped the consequences of having created a cocooned environment for regulatory enforcement around just one industry. And, sooner or later, what happened was kind of inevitable that industry wasn't able to generate broad-based enough growth, and the obvious glaring discrepancies in rule of law and in the growing illiberalness of the state eventually came home to roost. So, I mean, Bangladesh was never a development miracle. It was having rapid economic growth with weak institutions in the way that many countries do, and many of them end in exactly the same kind of political way that Bangladesh has. So what I'm saying is, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. So, one shouldn't expect too much consistency from my body of work. But the PDIA stuff is an organizational strategy that can work in a variety of contexts, but it's not a country level dynamic. And particularly, it's not a country level dynamic around the economic regulation of private sector activity. And that's where the closed order deal is going to work against you, because basically nobody wants higher quality, more autonomous, more independent, more effective regulatory institutions in a closed order deal environment. Beneficiaries, obviously, of the deals don't want it. The government who's giving the deals don't want it. And so it's a really difficult environment to build capability, and strong tensions to undermine independent autonomous regulatory agencies. So you can have strong macro and you can have reasonably strong service delivery, but not actually have, an equal opportunity economy. The first question is, I think there's three sets of countries that provide valuable lessons. One, and the paradigm is Korea. Korea was colonized by the Japanese and the Chinese and various other parties. And Korea is an interesting example because Korea started in the early 1960s with all of the problems of corruption, of military dictatorship, of useless U.S. foreign aid, many problems faced by lots of countries. And they basically, the elite leadership took the decision that they needed to develop industrial capability. And it wasn't laissez-faire. It wasn't that they had an open economy. They had closed order deals. There were certain large-scale industrial groupings that received favorable treatment from the government. And what Korea managed to do that other countries haven't is turn that into a positive dynamic in which the deal space was open enough they could expand their industrial base. It was export target driven, so they couldn't impose the cost on the domestic economy, and they couldn't suck themselves into the black hole of rent seeking. So Korea is now, in those graphs I show of national development, Korea is up there with the European countries in its level. The second example is Chile. Chile has a tumultuous history, but by the by the middle 2010 or so, Chile was very much on all of these indicators, very near the OECD levels. So they also managed to create a dynamic of increasing capability, increasing move to democracy after a dictatorship that lasted, I think, 10, 12 years. And then a stable democracy. So they have, and then the third set of countries, which is really interesting, I think an interesting set, is those countries that were in the Soviet Empire, which is a different, obviously, source of colonialization than the others. The ones that were close enough in capacity to the European Union actually have done really well. So some of the most successful countries over the last while are been the ones that have moved towards taken the pre-commitment of kind of EU participation or being proximate to the EU to get onto a dynamic of getting from high to higher levels of capability. So there have been an array of success countries, and there are countries, I think, that are on the pathway now. Indonesia has been, I lived in Indonesia immediately following the resignation of Suharto. And believe me, in 1998, when I went there, it did not look like it was a promising place for a successful kind of multiple transition to democracy capability and growth, but it's proven remarkably resilient in the succeeding 25 years.
All right, I think we have one more round of questions. So the first gentleman is in the second row here on the corner, and then Ijaz Saab is the second, and third is Imran. Go ahead.
Thank you. You spoke very high of the institutional credibility and institutional credibility leading to growth and development. Any link between that? The reason being the countries in the South, when they go into international relationships and trades, they follow a lot of regulations and conditionalities with their partners, which are actually on the compromising their institutional strength and rule of law. How do you look at it from the context of the growth path in this ecosystem?
Thank you. Hi, Lant. This is Ijaz Nabi.
Hey, Ijaz.
Hi. Eh, you're trashing the poverty line idea. I mean, it's appealing, but the new poverty line that a lot of people are working with has many elements of inclusion, education, health, access to other essentials. So I was wondering whether a broad-based poverty line comes closer to your definition of inclusion, so we don't need to throw the whole thing out. That's one thing. And secondly, when we measure state capability, which is a very vague concept, when we measure state capability, could we not anchor it in some cluster of variables about inclusion? If the state is able to deliver on those cluster of variables, we say that it is moving towards being a more capable state. So I was just wondering what you thought of that.
And third is over there in the middle, Imran. And Lant, this has become like more of a rapid round, so your responses will have to be like in 2-3 minutes.
Thanks, Lant. Very thought-provoking. So let me paint a scenario for you. Let's assume that we were to advise the finance minister of Pakistan, and we do subscribe to your view that wider economic development needs to be preferred over redistribution. But here's the dilemma in a political economy context. I have $100. I'm the finance minister, and I need to spend those $100 to do my job, but I also need to get my government reelected in 4 years. Right. So if I were to look at state capability and all that, good notions, I mean, for an average citizen, that's not measurable. But if I put $2 in somebody's pocket, I mean, they're very happy and they're probably going to vote for me. So, taking the clue from, you said pathways are important. I mean, what is the pathway then for countries like Pakistan, which are cash strapped, and the politicians have to make that choice?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer those first, second, third, as opposed to third, second, first, is that the first. So precisely what I was not saying was that investors' expectations are grounded in institutions. Precisely what a deals environment means is that investor expectations are personalized and politicized. And to say those are institutions just points out that institutions is a word like furniture. It's a level of abstraction of a noun that loses meaning. If I say, run to the store and get me some good furniture, what the hell are you supposed to come back with? A chair, a table, a desk? So when I taught at Harvard, I would give a piece of chalk to a student in the front row and say, if I use the word institutions, throw this at my head because I've stopped talking about something I know anything about. So I don't believe the word institutions is helpful at all. And these expectations are not grounded in institutions. They're grounded in deals. And often these deals are very concrete, very personalized, have nothing to do with rule of law. Nothing to do with the rule of law. I mean, if you wanted to invest in 1990 in Indonesia, you had to be in bed with Suharto, and it didn't matter what the law said, didn't matter what the court said, didn't matter what anything else said. If you weren't in bed with Suharto, you weren't going to have a successful investment experience. If you were, you were. So it's not institutions, it's deals. Second, I agree that if we get a high enough poverty line, we can use poverty. But let's be clear, we're just gaming the constructive ambiguity, because I agree with Angus Deaton that he is happy with poverty analysis with a poverty line of infinity. So yeah, if we drive, and I'm doing a paper, if you really drive a poverty line based on sets of, are we really achieving the SDGs at that poverty line, then you're at a poverty line that's actually very near the poverty line of the United States or Europe. So once we're to that poverty line, then yes, you have achieved a poverty line that defines inclusion, but you've done it by raising the poverty line such that you're really just gaming the word poverty at that stage. So we really have to end the use of low bar poverty lines. If we use high bar poverty lines and call it poverty, that's fine with me too. But until the poverty line gets above the median, you can't really say inclusion and poverty are the same thing. Say capability, I don't know. I think I don't want to go the outcomes path of measuring capability. I want to say here's a measure of how we think, the government, what the government has the capability to do, and try and measure the capability directly rather than directly to outcomes. But that said, there are lots of other ways to go about it, and I'm not sure exactly where that gets, but I'm pretty. And the second problem is precisely the phenomena I'm talking about, you will never be able to measure, because I'm measuring the gap between the rule as it exists on paper and the actual practice. And no government in the world wants you to be able to measure that, because it's a measure of the extent to which they're not living by their own laws and rules. So I don't think that's going to be a promising path. Last, I think governments are just wrong. I think governments should listen to the Beatles, because the Beatles understood that money can't buy you love. And the idea that you can give a person $2 and they therefore will vote for you, I think is I don't know that that's really true. And in particular, if I were Minister of Finance and I said, I can make the conditions for people to be successful economically in a way that they put $2 in their own pocket through their own earnings, or put $2 in your pocket by taking it from you in sales taxes and giving it back to you. Everybody sees through that illusion. The tax money has to have come from somewhere. And with rudimentary tax systems, the redistributive, total net redistributive element of these transfers is very low, right? If you tax broad-based consumption and then give people the money back from that, the net redistribution is very, very small relative to the gross redistribution, and a lot gets lost in the channel. So I'm at all convinced that, most of the political unrest I see that ends governments is equal access to opportunity and access to good jobs for the aspirational middle class, not giving people a pittance in targeted programs and therefore they'll love us. I don't think that's an optimal political use of dollars. But the point you raise is very deep and important, which is if you don't have a capable state, the government can't promise anything else. And I worry this emphasis on targeting is hollowing out the state. The state really should do radically better at providing broad-based infrastructure that facilitates productivity and instead of tackling that and tackling human capital and tackling effective enforcement of rule of law, they're thinking we won't do any of those hard complex things because they won't pay it for us. Off in the short run, just give people money. That's a pathway to disaster. That's a pathway to disaster, not and maybe it's right in the short run, but I don't even think it's right in the short run, but it's certainly damaging in the long run. But that's what happens when you get into a dynamic of low state capability, and that's the danger.
So on that note, pitting pathways to development with pathways to disaster. There are many questions here, Lant, but we'll just have to get you to Pakistan again for people to ask questions directly from you. I think we've run out of time. I know there are questions. Feel free to send it to the organizers, and we'll try to send them to Lant and get answers. But please join me in thanking Lant for giving a pretty inspirational lecture and giving us a sense for what possible pathways there could be to development. Thank you.